Okay, so you sent over some reports on this Israel-Hamas ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like things are getting a little shaky.
Yeah.
I mean, it felt like just weeks ago that this was like this huge step forward.
It really did seem like it, yeah. After, over a year of really intense conflict,
Right.
both sides agreed to this truce at the end of January, and there was a plan in place for, phased release of hostages held by Hamas
Yeah.
in exchange for, the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel.
Yeah.
So it did feel like a glimmer of hope.
Yeah. Okay, so then where did things start to go wrong?
Well,
These reports are talking about accusations.
right.
Ultimatums.
Yeah.
It feels like we're on the brink of it collapsing.
The hostage release is really at the heart of this tension.
Okay.
Hamas initially threatened to delay the release of a group of hostages, claiming that Israel wasn't holding up their end of the bargain,
Right.
especially when it comes to aid and reconstruction efforts in Gaza.
Okay, so these reports are mentioning specific accusations from Hamas
Yes.
about restrictions on things like housing materials and heavy machinery
Yeah.
needed for rebuilding.
Right.
Is there any merit to these claims?
Well, an Egyptian source close to the negotiations actually provided CNN with a list of 19 alleged violations by Israel.
Wow.
So whether these are genuine concerns or a tactic to gain leverage is really, the key question here.
Right.
Hamas knows that the world is watching, and, by highlighting these issues, they put pressure on Israel to really show their commitment to
Right.
the ceasefire.
Yeah, it's a risky game, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Isn't it? I mean, pushing too hard could backfire and completely derail the agreement.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act.
Right.
Hamas wants to be seen as, fighting for the needs of the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
But they also don't want to be blamed for the ceasefire falling apart.
Right, right. Okay, and then on top of all of that, you've got President Trump,
Yes.
adding his own unique perspective
His
to the mix here.
His statements have certainly added another layer of complexity to this.
Right.
His call for the immediate release of all hostages, which kind of contrasts with Israel's more measured approach
Mm-hmm.
of, focusing on securing the living captives first,
Okay.
really raises questions about, the level of alignment between the U.S. and Israel right now.
Some might even argue that sanctioning the ICC is actually undermining the peace process
Yeah.
by shielding Israel from accountability.
Right.
How do you think this move impacts the credibility
That's a really good question.
of these peace efforts?
It's a valid concern, and the ICC has been investigating potential war crimes committed by both sides during the conflict.
Right.
And, these sanctions are seen by many as an attempt by the U.S. to protect Israel from scrutiny.
Right.
It certainly complicates the situation, and it raises questions about whether the U.S. is truly committed to a neutral and balanced approach
Yeah.
to this conflict.
It's interesting, though, right?
Yeah,
Because at the same time, you have Trump suggesting these ideas,
right.
like resettling Palestinians elsewhere,
Uh-huh.
or even a potential U.S. takeover of Gaza.
Right.
I mean, these ideas have been met with pretty widespread condemnation,
They have.
haven't they?
Yeah, they really...
From all sides.
These proposals, even if they're just hypothetical, have further inflamed tensions
Yeah,
and alienated key players in the region. It underscores the challenges of finding a solution
Right.
that satisfies all sides and really the need for more pragmatic and realistic approaches.
okay, so we've got this backdrop of accusations, ultimatums, and some pretty unconventional ideas being floated. But let's not lose sight of the human cost of this conflict.
Absolutely.
We have reports here detailing the desperate need for aid in Gaza after the war.
Yes, this is a crucial point. The war has left Gaza devastated,
Yeah,
with widespread destruction of infrastructure and a critical shortage of basic necessities.
right.
The reports you shared highlight the urgent need for food, water, fuel, medical supplies, and shelter equipment.
Right.
Imagine trying to rebuild your life.
Yeah,
To create some sense of normalcy for your family
right.
with such limited access to even the most basic necessities.
Yeah,
It's a truly dire situation.
absolutely. And it's not just about, rebuilding these like physical structures,
Right.
The psychological toll on the people of Gaza must be just immense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Trauma, grief, displacement.
Yeah,
These are all, invisible wounds that take a long time to heal.
right.
And when you layer on top of that the daily struggle for survival, the lack of basic resources, the uncertainty about the future,
Yeah.
it creates an incredibly challenging environment for people to recover and rebuild their lives.
One of the reports mentioned that some aid groups have been struggling to get supplies into Gaza,
Yeah,
citing bureaucratic hurdles and security concerns.
right.
Is Israel intentionally hindering the flow of aid, Or are there legitimate reasons for these restrictions?
It's a complex issue, and there are definitely valid security concerns that need to be addressed.
Right.
However, there are also concerns that some of these restrictions are politically motivated, aimed at pressuring Hamas, rather than, genuinely addressing security risks. So it's a difficult balance to strike.
Yeah.
And it's essential to ensure humanitarian aid reaches those who need it most, regardless of the political dynamics at play.
Okay, so we've talked about the situation in Gaza.
Right.
But what about the impact on Israel?
Yeah.
It's easy to forget that this conflict has deeply affected both sides.
You're absolutely right. It's important to remember that the conflict has taken a toll on Israeli society as well.
Right.
There's a constant sense of insecurity, a fear of rocket attacks, the trauma of losing loved ones.
Yeah.
And the ongoing conflict also creates deep divisions within Israeli society itself, with differing views on how to achieve peace and security.
You mentioned earlier the human cost of this conflict.
Yeah.
And the reports we're looking at include some stark numbers.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands killed in Gaza.
Right.
Over 1,000 in Israel.
It's a tragic reminder of what's at stake.
Absolutely.
Those numbers represent real people, families whose lives have been shattered by this conflict.
Yeah.
And while the ceasefire has brought a pause to the violence,
Right.
the underlying issues that fueled the war remain unresolved.
Yeah.
The need for a lasting solution, one that addresses the root causes of the conflict and ensures the security and well-being of both Palestinians and Israelis, has never been more urgent.
It feels like we're in this holding pattern, waiting to see if this ceasefire will hold. There's that deadline set by both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu for the next stage of the hostage release this Saturday.
Yep.
What are the potential scenarios if Hamas doesn't meet that deadline?
It's a critical moment, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
If Hamas doesn't release the hostages as agreed, it could trigger a collapse of the ceasefire and a return to open conflict.
Right.
On the other hand, if they do release the hostages, it could build trust and momentum towards further negotiations.
Right.
But even then, there's a long road ahead filled with difficult compromises and complex challenges.
It seems like everyone involved is walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
Trying to balance their own interests with the need to prevent a wider war.
Exactly. It's a delicate dance, and one misstep could have devastating consequences.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the immediate parties involved.
Right.
The international community also has a role to play in supporting the peace process and holding both sides accountable for upholding their commitments.
Yeah, it really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It does.
The decisions made by leaders, the actions of these armed groups, the flow of aid, it all, it has a direct impact on the lives of these ordinary people just trying to survive and rebuild.
Absolutely. And it underscores the need for, a more holistic approach to peace building, one that not only addresses the immediate security concerns, but also tackles, the underlying social, economic, and political factors that contribute to this cycle of violence.
So as we approach this Saturday deadline, what do you think are the most important things for us to keep in mind as we follow this story?
I think it's crucial to remember that this conflict is not, a simple black and white issue.
Yeah.
There are deep historical grievances,
Right.
complex power dynamics, and, competing narratives that need to be understood and addressed. It's also important to avoid falling into the trap of demonizing one side or the other.
Yeah.
Both Israelis and Palestinians have legitimate concerns and aspirations.
Right.
And any lasting solution is going to require empathy, compromise, and a willingness to listen to each other's perspectives.
And how can our listeners, who are obviously, concerned and engaged with this issue, how can they contribute to a more peaceful resolution?
Well, staying informed is a great first step.
Right.
Which you're already doing by listening to this deep dive.
Of course.
You can also support organizations that are working on the ground.
Yeah.
To provide humanitarian aid and promote dialogue and reconciliation.
Right.
Even small actions like, sharing information on social media or engaging in respectful conversations with others can help to shift the narrative and create space for more nuanced and constructive approaches to peace building.
Yeah, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of all of this.
It is.
And the, seemingly intractable nature of this conflict. But you're right.
Yeah.
Even these small acts of understanding and engagement can make a difference.
Absolutely. And remember, peace is not just the absence of war.
Right.
It's the presence of justice, equality, and opportunity for all.
Mm-hmm.
It's a goal worth striving for, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges.
As we wrap up here, it feels like we're leaving things on a little bit of a cliffhanger.
It does.
Saturday's deadline looms large, and the fate of the ceasefire hangs in the balance.
Yeah.
If you were mediating this right now, what would be your top priority? Securing the immediate release of all of the hostages.
Yeah.
Ensuring aid gets to those who need it most.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer.
Right.
But I think it's essential to recognize that all of these issues are interconnected. You can't really address the hostage situation without addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Right.
And you can't achieve lasting peace without tackling the underlying political issues that fuel the conflict.
Right.
It's a complex puzzle, and it requires a multifaceted approach.
Well, it has been a fascinating, albeit sobering, deep dive into this incredibly complex situation. Hopefully, you now feel better equipped to understand the nuances of this conflict as it continues to unfold.
Right.
Stay tuned, because as we've seen, things can change quickly.
And keep in mind, even amidst all the tension and uncertainty, there's always hope.
Yeah.
Hope for a future where dialogue replaces violence, where empathy bridges divides, and where peace prevails.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.